Hey everyone! Just a quick reminder to subscribe and hit that like button if you're enjoying my stories. It really helps me know you're into the content. Thanks for tuning in, and let's dive right in. I've lived in New York City my entire life, 42 years to be exact, and I thought I'd seen just about everything. But nothing could have prepared me for what happened on that day. I had spent the last 10 years working an ordinary office job, slinging spreadsheets and attending mind-numbing meetings. The kind of job where every day blends into the next. But that all changed when I was promoted to a new position, one that would have me traveling to meet clients at their offices all over the city. It sounded exciting. I was finally going to step out of my comfort zone, shake things up. At least that's what I told myself as I walked into the lobby of a building in the heart of the city. This wasn't just any building. It was one of those massive, imposing high-rises with a sleek glass exterior and at least 40 floors. The kind of place you look up at from the street and wonder how it's even possible to fit that many offices into one structure. I had a meeting with a client on the 36th floor. I was nervous, of course. New job, new responsibilities, new people. But I was also excited. I couldn't deny it. I was proud of this promotion. I was climbing the ladder, stepping into something bigger. As I stepped into the elevator, I felt the familiar buzz of anticipation mixed with anxiety. I pressed the button for the 36th floor, the little light flickering to life beside it. The doors closed, and the elevator began its slow ascent. But then, unexpectedly, it stopped. The floor display blinked, showing 4, and the doors opened to reveal nothing but an empty hallway. My heart skipped a beat. It wasn't that strange. The elevator had to stop for other people after all. But I couldn't shake the unease that crept up my spine. A man stepped into the elevator, and I didn't think much of it at first. He was tall, dressed in a dark suit, his face a little too pale for comfort. His eyes were hard to place, cold like he was somewhere else, far away. He pressed a series of buttons. 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Each one lit up as he selected it. I watched him curiously. He wasn't acting like someone simply heading to his office. He didn't even press the button for his own floor. It was as if he was looking for something. Or someone. He didn't look at me. Instead, he peered out at each floor as the elevator passed. Not just a glance. No, he craned his neck, eyes scanning the hallway outside as though he expected someone to appear. The strange thing was, nobody did. At floor 9, the doors opened again. Without a word, the man stepped out. I was left standing there, unsure of what had just happened, but feeling something odd in the pit of my stomach. Something wasn't right. The doors closed, and the elevator resumed its journey, but instead of heading up, it dropped down to floor 10. The elevator didn't stop there, though. It didn't open. It just kept going. The little light above the floor numbers blinked and went dark as the elevator descended. It didn't stop at floor 1, like it should have. Instead, it continued to the basement. My anxiety spiked. What was happening? I had never felt so uneasy. Then, just as I was starting to think the elevator might be malfunctioning, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out quickly, hoping for some distraction, and saw the emergency alert flash across the screen. Emergency alert. Do not get out of the elevator. The word sent a chill through me. I glanced up at the elevator doors, which were now standing wide open in front of the basement. I could see nothing but darkness beyond. My heart pounded in my chest as I debated what to do. My fingers hovered over the emergency button, but what if that was just part of whatever this was? What if pressing it made things worse? The elevator remained still, silent. I tried pressing every button, anything to make it stop moving, to give me some sense of control. But nothing worked. Panic started to bubble in my throat. My mind raced. What was happening? Was this a prank? Was there something wrong with the elevator? Then I heard it. A thud. A heavy, hollow sound that echoed from the darkness beyond the elevator doors. My breath caught in my throat. I froze. It wasn't just a bump or a malfunction. It was deliberate, purposeful. A pause. Then another thud, louder this time. Closer. I squeezed my eyes shut, willing myself to stay calm, but the thuds kept coming, getting closer and closer, each one more menacing than the last. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. I felt like I was trapped in the worst kind of nightmare, and every instinct told me to run, but my body wouldn't obey. And then, just as I thought I couldn't take it anymore, The elevator doors slammed shut. The bang was deafening. The sound of the impact felt like it came from the other side, but the dent left in the doors made it clear. Whatever had been out there was closer than I ever could have imagined. The elevator jerked to life, its lights flickering back on. It began its ascent once more, as if nothing had happened. I stood there, trembling, staring at the flickering floor indicator, too stunned to react. I barely noticed as the elevator passed floor 5, the floor where I had originally boarded, and then slowed down at what felt like the strangest of places. The doors opened again. I don't know how much time passed after the doors slammed shut, but it felt like hours. The elevator jolted slightly as it ascended, but I wasn't sure where I was going anymore. I kept my eyes fixed on the floor indicator, the flickering lights above casting long shadows in the small, confined space. My heartbeat thudded in my chest as I tried to make sense of what had just happened. What was that thing out there? What were those sounds? I could still hear them in my mind. The thuds, each one sharper and more deliberate than the last. It wasn't just some malfunction, something was out there. I squeezed my bag tighter, feeling the rough fabric dig into my palm. I needed to stay calm. I needed to think. But how could I think when every instinct told me to run, to do anything to get away from whatever was following me? Then suddenly, another thud echoed from the darkness beyond the elevator doors. Thud. 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 Each sound was louder than the last, the intervals between them growing shorter, closer. I could feel my breath quickening. Shallow, frantic. The fear in my chest tightened with every echo of those heavy footsteps. It was impossible to ignore now. Whatever was out there was coming for me. I crouched down instinctively, pressing my back against the cold, metal walls of the elevator, clutching my bag to my chest like it could somehow protect me. I stared at the doors, willing them to stay closed, praying that whatever was outside couldn't get in, and then, bang! A deafening crash shook the elevator. My whole body flinched as the sound reverberated through the walls. My heart skipped, and I gasped, wide-eyed. A loud, unmistakable noise, a forceful strike against the elevator doors. And then, I saw it. A dent, a deep indentation in the metal, right where the impact had hit. My eyes widened in shock. Something had slammed into the door with so much force that it left a visible mark. Something was trying to get in. Panic surged through me, hot and sharp. I shot my gaze to the control panel, desperately pressing the button for floor 36, again and again, but nothing happened. The elevator didn't even respond. My pulse raced, the air feeling thicker, heavier with each passing second. It was like the walls were closing in. The elevator jerked suddenly. I gasped, my hand gripping the rail by the door. It moved, not upward, but back downward again, suddenly accelerating. I tried to steady myself, but the motion threw me off balance. This wasn't the elevator I had gotten into. And then, ding, the elevator stopped, the doors opening with an eerie softness. The sight beyond was enough to make me freeze in place. Floor 5. But it didn't look like the 5th floor I had seen earlier. The hallway that stretched out before me was bathed in a sickly, dim light. The walls were covered in streaks, like blood had been smeared across them. The floor was wet in patches, like something had been spilled and left to rot. It didn't feel like the same building. It didn't even feel like the same world. I had to blink several times to make sure my eyes weren't playing tricks on me. The hallway stretched far beyond the elevator, but there was no sign of life. No people, no workers, no normal office sounds. Just silence. Then I heard something else. A scream. I spun toward the sound, my breath catching in my throat. At the far end of the hallway, a woman was running, no, fleeing. She was dressed in torn clothes, blood soaking the fabric, her face contorted in pure terror. Her frantic footsteps echoed in the otherwise empty hall as she screamed at the top of her lungs. "Help, please, somebody help me." Her voice was high-pitched, panicked, and desperate. But what chilled me wasn't the scream. It was what she was running from. The darkness. Behind her, the lights in the hallway flickered out as she passed. One by one, each light blinked off, plunging the corridor further into shadow. Whatever was chasing her was just behind. I could hear her gasping for breath, but she didn't look back. She just ran, faster, harder, like her life depended on it. And then the moment she came closer to the elevator, I saw it. The darkness. It was alive. A crawling, twisting mass that seemed to follow the woman. It wasn't just shadows, it was something tangible, something hungry. My body froze, my mind screamed at me to do something, to get away, but my feet were glued to the floor. I wanted to help. I wanted to reach out, to save her, but I couldn't. The woman was getting closer, her eyes wide with fear, her hands outstretched toward the elevator doors, as if the elevator was her only salvation. She was only a few feet away from me now, but I couldn't move. I couldn't even breathe. And then, the doors started to close. I didn't think, I just acted. My hand shot out to stop them, my fingers wedged between the cold metal. The doors reluctantly slid open again, and the woman stumbled into the elevator with me. She was panting, her body shaking, her bloodied hands pressing against the walls as she backed away from the now shut doors. Her eyes were wild, her fists clenched. She was ready to fight, to push me away. "Who are you?" The words had hit me like a slap, and my stomach twisted into knots. I opened my mouth to respond, but my throat was dry. "I'm Anne. I'm just visiting a client. I'm on the 36th floor. I've never..." I stopped, my voice faltering. What was I supposed to say? That I had no idea what was happening? That I was as scared as she was? The woman stared at me, her expression unreadable for a moment before she slowly, carefully, unclenched her fists. The tension in her shoulders eased just a fraction, but her eyes never left me. Then, with a shaky breath, she spoke again, but her voice wasn't as harsh now, just raw, desperate. "What time is it?" I didn't hesitate. My phone was still clutched in my hand, trembling slightly. I unlocked it and glanced at the screen. 2:16 p.m. I held the phone up to show her, my fingers trembling as I did. Her eyes went wide, her face draining of color. She muttered something under her breath that I couldn't quite catch. Something about it being impossible, and then louder. That's not possible." She turned away from me, pacing back and forth in the small space of the elevator, her hands running through her hair in frustration. Her voice was quieter now, as though she was talking to herself more than to me. "I got in at 2:10. I'm sure of it. I was on the ground floor, trying to get to a meeting. Just like you. But then..." Her words faltered, and she shook her head like she was trying to shake the thoughts out. She stopped pacing and looked directly at me. Her eyes wide, frantic. "I've been stuck in this elevator for hours, Anne. I don't know how long, but it feels like days." The air in the elevator seemed to grow thicker, heavier. I swallowed hard. I was still processing her words, trying to make sense of everything that had happened since I'd gotten on. I looked at her closely. Her clothes were torn, dirty, and there were streaks of blood on her arms. But it wasn't just that. There was something else in her eyes. Something I couldn't name, but it felt wrong. "What happened to you?" I finally managed to ask. She took a deep breath, her hands trembling as she spoke. "You heard it, didn't you?" She glanced at the elevator doors, as though the darkness beyond them was still right there, still following her. "The bangs. The darkness. It was just like what you're going through now." I nodded, my stomach sinking. The thuds, the sense of something lurking, something right outside the doors. It was all too familiar. Her voice dropped lower, barely a whisper now, but it carried an edge of panic. "When the elevator started moving down, I thought it was just another malfunction, but then it stopped and I was in the basement. The lights were off. I couldn't see anything. I tried the buttons, nothing worked. Then I heard the thuds. I thought I was going crazy, but I wasn't. Something was out there with me." She clenched her fists again, her nails digging into her palms. "I pressed every button I could find, but they didn't work. I couldn't make it stop. And then..." She paused, her face contorted in fear. I could feel the anxiety pulsing off her. "And then, there was another floor," she continued, her voice tight. "It wasn't like anything else. Smoke started filling the elevator, heat. I couldn't breathe. I thought I was going to pass out. It was like a fire, but it didn't feel real. I thought I was dead for sure, but then..." She stopped, taking a shuddering breath, as though even speaking about it was enough to bring the terror flooding back. "When I woke up, I was on floor 5, she finished, her voice barely a whisper. "Just like you. But it wasn't the same floor, it was different." I leaned in, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. "What do you mean, different?" She shook her head, her voice trembling as she continued. "The floor, it was collapsing, Anne. It was falling apart, crumbling beneath my feet. The walls, everything. I was running, but not from the darkness anymore. I wasn't running from something. I was running from the floor itself. The building was falling apart. I felt the weight of her words hit me like a punch in the gut. Everything inside me wanted to scream, wanted to run, but I stayed still, unable to move. My mind was racing. Was this some kind of nightmare? Was I hallucinating all of this? The woman seemed to sense my hesitation. She looked at me, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and something else. A kind of desperation that echoed my own. "It's not a nightmare, Anne," she said softly, her voice broken. "It's real, and it's going to keep getting worse. I don't know how to stop it. I don't even know where we are anymore." The reality of her words sank in, and the silence that followed was deafening. My heart pounded in my chest as the elevator continued its relentless climb, but the questions swirling in my mind only grew. Where were we really? What was happening to this building? And more importantly, what was coming for us next? The elevator jerked to a sudden stop, and for a moment, everything felt still. Too still. I glanced at the woman, her face tense with anxiety, her body stiff as if she were bracing for something to happen. I didn't want to look at the panel, didn't want to know which floor we were on, but I couldn't help myself. The numbers flickered faintly in the dim light. 13. Floor 13? I muttered under my breath. I wasn't superstitious, but something about the number felt wrong. The doors slid open, and a rush of cold air flooded the elevator. My skin prickled, as if the air itself had turned to ice. We both hesitated before stepping out onto the floor. The office space beyond the elevator was dark, and I had to blink several times to make sure I wasn't seeing things. It didn't look anything like the bustling office floors I was used to in the city. No buzzing fluorescent lights, no distant chatter or ringing phones. Just silence. It wasn't like any office I'd ever seen. It was sterile, empty. The lights were off, and the whole space was dead. The floor seemed abandoned, but even worse, it felt like it had been abandoned for years. There were no desks, no chairs, no computers, just rows of blank walls, no signs of life. The air had a heavy, stale quality to it, like it hadn't been disturbed in years. The walls were bare, but what stood out was the broken glass scattered across the floor. It was like someone had smashed every window, and now only the jagged remnants remained. "Where are we?" I whispered, my voice shaky. The woman didn't answer at first. Her eyes were scanning the room, and I could see the same unease I felt reflected in her face. "I don't know," she said quietly, though her voice seemed to echo in the empty space. It made the silence feel even more suffocating. We stepped farther into the office, the crunch of glass beneath our feet the only sound to break the silence. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us, but every time I turned my head, there was nothing. Just the same blank walls and the eerie quiet that made it seem like the whole building had been abandoned decades ago. Then I heard it. A faint whisper, so soft I almost thought I imagined it. It wasn't in any language I knew, just a garbled murmur like someone was speaking right behind me. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. I wasn't imagining it. The whispering was real. I glanced at the woman, but she was staring ahead, her face pale, her breath shallow. I could tell she heard it too. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice barely above a breath. She nodded, her eyes wide. "Yeah. But there's no one here." The whispering grew louder, more distinct, as if whatever was making the noise was getting closer. I felt it before I saw it. The air began to shift. It grew heavier, colder. The kind of cold that seeps into your bones and makes your skin crawl. Then, with a deafening slam, the elevator doors behind us slammed shut. The sound made me jump, but when I turned around, the elevator was still there, dormant, empty. I rushed to press the button, desperate to leave this strange, oppressive space. But when I looked back at the floor, the room seemed to change. It wasn't just the empty office floor I had seen before. The walls, everything, had warped. They weren't the same. The edges of the floor blurred and twisted. The glass on the ground now seemed to move like liquid, and the air thickened, pressing in on us like it was alive. The whispering was all around us now, louder and clearer than before, but still, there was no one to be seen. "Something's wrong," the woman said, her voice a choked whisper, but I could hear the fear in it now. "We need to get out of here." I pressed the button to summon the elevator, but the doors wouldn't open. It was like the elevator didn't recognize our urgency. It ignored us completely, leaving us in the increasingly claustrophobic space. The distorted reality of the office floor felt like it was closing in on us. It felt alive. I don't know how long we stood there, frozen in place, waiting for the elevator to respond, but when it finally did, it was as if the building had decided to play some twisted joke on us. The doors opened, but instead of revealing the normal floor we'd left behind, it revealed something else entirely. It wasn't the same. It couldn't be. The elevator doors opened to reveal a distorted reflection of the office floor we had just left. It looked off. The walls were now coated in dark streaks, like someone had smeared blood along them. The air inside the elevator was thick, suffocating, and I could feel the panic rising in my chest. I stepped back, and so did the woman. We both stared at the door, at the warped version of the floor, as the whispering grew louder, more insistent, as if the floor was alive and beckoning us to step through. But I couldn't. There was something horribly wrong here, something that didn't belong in this world. I didn't know what it was, but I knew we were far beyond anything I'd ever experienced. I can't go in there, I whispered, feeling the walls of the elevator closing in. The woman nodded, her face as pale as I felt. Me neither. I don't know what would have happened if we had stepped through that door, but we didn't have to find out. The doors slid closed again, just as quickly as they had opened, and the elevator started to move, again. I didn't dare ask where it was going next. The elevator jolted again, and we were thrown off balance for a moment before it came to a sudden stop. I couldn't even bring myself to look at the floor number this time. I had grown too afraid of what awaited us. I had to keep my focus on the woman standing next to me, on the only thing in this nightmare that felt even remotely real. When the doors slid open, a cold gust of air washed over us. But it wasn't just cold. It was wet. Damp. As soon as I stepped out, I felt the water sloshing around my ankles. My breath caught in my throat as I realized what this was. The entire floor, floor 21, was flooded. The water was dark and murky, with a strange, unsettling sheen to it. It was hard to see how deep it went, but it didn't matter. I could feel the weight of the wet floor beneath me, could feel the dampness creeping up around my shoes. The ceiling above us was leaking in several places, water dripping down in slow, rhythmic patterns that only added to the eerie atmosphere of the place. The entire room had a low, oppressive buzz to it, like an electrical hum that never stopped. Is this real? The woman's voice was barely above a whisper, her eyes wide, scanning the room with the same fear that gripped me. I don't know, I murmured, stepping forward cautiously, testing the waters, both literal and metaphorical. My heart was pounding in my chest, but I had no choice but to move. The silence was unbearable, and the only thing louder than our footsteps in the water was that strange buzzing sound coming from somewhere up ahead. It was almost like the floor was alive, but with something wrong about it, like we were walking through a ghostly version of a world we didn't belong in. We continued down the flooded hallway, the water now up to our shins, when I noticed something that made my blood freeze. At first, I thought it was just the flickering of the overhead lights reflecting off the water. But then I saw it again. A shadow. Something large, moving just beneath the surface of the water. It wasn't a trick of the light, or a ripple from the ceiling leaks. No, there was something moving under the water. I stopped dead in my tracks, and the woman did the same. We both stood there, frozen, staring at the dark shape that seemed to glide through the water toward us. It wasn't just one shadow anymore. There were more, shifting in the depths. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. Then, the shadow broke the surface. It wasn't just a shadow. It was a figure, a person. No, not a person, a corpse. The figure was submerged in the water, their body pale, skin slick and lifeless, their arms reaching toward us with unnatural, jerking movements. Their eyes, wide and unblinking, stared directly at us, black and empty, as though they had been submerged for far too long. I felt my chest tighten, the air sucked out of my lungs. Do you see that? The woman's voice cracked, her hands trembling at her sides. I couldn't answer. I couldn't speak. The thing's arm reached higher, stretching unnaturally toward us, and I could feel the water around my legs growing colder, as if the temperature itself was being pulled down by this thing. The world around us seemed to distort for a moment, and all I could hear was the pulse of the buzzing, louder now, like an electric current building in intensity. I wanted to run. My body screamed at me to get away from this thing, to get back in the elevator and never look back. But I couldn't tear my gaze away. The figure was rising, its face coming into view as its body moved upward, as if the water was no longer an obstacle, as if it were coming for us, for me. A loud chime suddenly interrupted my thoughts, and I felt the cold weight lift from my chest, though the terror was far from gone. The elevator doors slid open behind us, the light spilling from the shaft, a stark contrast to the darkness of the flooded floor. I didn't wait. I didn't need to. Without another word, the woman and I bolted toward the elevator, our feet splashing loudly in the water as we hurried to escape. The moment I stepped inside the elevator, the doors slammed shut with a heavy finality. We both collapsed against the walls, panting. But there was no relief. The elevator didn't ascend, it didn't go up, it didn't even go down. Instead, there was a strange, sinking sensation. The floor beneath our feet seemed to shift, to move, and I felt as though I were falling, as though the entire building was sinking into the earth. I gripped the metal panel for support, my heart racing. The woman pressed her hand against the wall, her breathing erratic. "What is this?" she asked, but I couldn't answer. We had already gone deeper than I had ever thought possible. But now, I had no idea how much further down we were going, or where we'd end up. I didn't want to know anymore, but we had no choice. The elevator had taken us too far, and I could only wait to see what would happen next. The elevator jerked to a stop, its usual mechanical groan more pronounced in the silent air. My eyes shot open in shock, my heart pounding as I looked at the floor indicator. Floor 30. But something was wrong. This floor didn't feel like the others. There was no buzzing, no flickering lights, no sounds of distant horror. It was too quiet, too still. The doors creaked open, and I saw the lobby, well, what was left of it. It was as though the place had been abandoned for years, forgotten, and left to rot. The floor was cracked, chunks of tiles missing, and the walls were covered in peeling paint and shattered glass. What used to be a bright, bustling reception area was now just a hollow shell of decay. Dust floated in the air, thick and oppressive, and the stench of mold lingered, twisting in the stagnant air. It was a ghost town, a dead place. The woman and I didn't even step out. We both stood there, staring at the desolation that awaited us outside the elevator. For a long moment we didn't speak, the weight of the situation too heavy for words. I glanced at her. Her face was pale, more so than before, and her eyes, those eyes were sunken with exhaustion and fear. We had been through hell together, floor after floor of nightmares, of impossible horrors, but we had made it this far. Maybe we could make it out. "I don't think we're going to get out of here," the woman said softly, her voice cracking. This place, it's endless." I didn't want to admit it, but she was right. I felt it, too. The hopelessness, the crushing knowledge that we had been stuck in this elevator for who knows how long. The building wasn't real anymore. Nothing felt real anymore. Time had become distorted, the floors blurred together like memories that no longer made sense. I shook my head, trying to clear my thoughts. But we can't give up. We have to find a way out. There's always a way. But deep down, I knew we had already passed the point of no return. This wasn't just an elevator anymore. It was a prison. A twisted, broken world where time didn't exist, and escaping wasn't just difficult. It was impossible. She met my eyes, and for the first time, I saw the truth in her expression. She didn't say anything, but I knew, she knew. We had been through so much, and the only way out was, well, there was no way out, not for both of us. The silence between us stretched on, heavy with the unspoken words, until the elevator doors slammed shut behind us. It wasn't just a noise, it felt like a finality. A closing of a door, not just to this space, but to everything. And then the elevator began to move again. Ding! The sound of the chime startled me. My heart raced, wondering where we were headed now. But when the doors opened, I saw nothing, just an endless blackness beyond the doors. There was no floor, no walls, just darkness. And I knew deep down that the elevator had finally taken us to the place where we would never escape. A voice broke through my thoughts. The woman spoke again, but this time, there was a resigned calmness to her words. "I've been here too long," she said. "Too long to turn back now. There's nothing left to hold on to." I swallowed hard, trying to find the words. No, please, don't. But she had already made up her mind. I could see it in her eyes. She knew what needed to be done. I can't stay here with you, I'm so sorry, she said, her voice trembling. But I have to try. I have to. I need to go. I can't live like this anymore. She stepped toward the dark void, her figure barely visible against the blackness. I couldn't move. I didn't know what to say. I wanted to stop her, to tell her to stay with me. We could fight together. But the truth was, there was nothing left to fight for. Goodbye, she whispered, and I saw her face one last time before she stepped into the void. The elevator doors closed behind her, sealing her fate. I stared at the doors as they shut with a soft click, and for a moment I felt nothing. No sorrow, no relief, just emptiness. A cold, hollow feeling. I had watched her disappear into the unknown, and now I was left behind. The elevator jerked again and I could feel it moving, somewhere deeper into the darkness. I didn't even bother to look at the floors anymore. It didn't matter. It wasn't real. None of it was. I sat there, on the cold metal floor of the elevator, letting my body absorb the weight of what had just happened. The walls around me seemed to close in, but I didn't care. My mind was numb. I had let her go. I had watched her leave. And as I sat there, the memories of my life, of my home in New York, of everything I had known, began to fade. Everything was slipping away, the world becoming more distant, more fragmented with each passing second. It was over. I couldn't stop it. I didn't know where this elevator was taking me, but in that moment, I realized that I was already gone. The doors remained shut, and the darkness stretched on, infinitely long.